everyone. So we will get started with the afternoon of day one for the conference. I have the pleasure of introducing both Dr. Lisa Callahan and Robin Cuff. I'm just going to open this up here. So Robin is the manager of a variety of specialty concurrent disorder treatment programs at CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, including the Toronto Drug Treatment Court program. Previously, she has led agencies providing women's residential addiction treatment, withdrawal management, services for substance-involved women and their children, and a program for pregnant and parenting teenagers and their children. Robin is a registered psychotherapist, is a faculty member of the William Glasser Institute for Choice Theory, Reality Therapy, and Lead Management, and has extensive training in addictions and concurrent disorders and trauma-informed care. Robin has a strong commitment to creating client-centered, trauma-informed services and team cultures, and is particularly passionate about working with people who have been marginalized on a systemic level. With a knowledge exchange lens, she has contributed to the development of provincial best practices and standards for women's addiction treatment, withdrawal management, and the treatment of women with trauma and addiction. In conjunction with the Organization of American States, Robin has traveled to the Caribbean and Latin America, presenting to government, justice, law enforcement, and health officials on drug treatment courts, alternatives to incarceration, partnership development, substance use, social justice, health equity, mental health, trauma, and stigma. I'm also introducing Lisa Callahan. So Lisa Callahan is a senior research associate at Policy Research Associates, Inc., where she is involved in research, technical assistance, and training. She received her PhD from the Ohio State University in 1983 and completed an NIMH postdoctoral program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Medical School. Dr. Callahan works on many SAMHSA projects at the Gain Center, leading numerous communities of practice, including the 2019-2021 Competence to Stand Trial, the 2021 Building a Better Crisis System of Care Communities of Practice, and 2020 MAT across the SIM community of practice. Dr. Callahan presented on opioid-focused SIM mappings at the 2020 New York State Treatment Court Conference and the 2020 COAP National Conference. She coordinates technical assistance for many SAMHSA grant programs focused on treatment courts. She recently led the SAMHSA and BJA expert panel on MAT in the justice system, best practices for psychiatrists working with justice involved in community care, assisted outpatient commitment, and competence to stand trial. She is the co-recipient of the 2021 Manfred Guttmacher Award from the American Psychiatrists Association with Dr. Deborah Pinnels for their publication Complements to Stand Trial. Further, she co-authored a recent article on barriers to implementing MAT across the SIM. Dr. Callahan is a member of the research team with RTI to evaluate SAMHSA's AOT grantee programs. She was the project director for the MacArthur Foundation's Mental Health Court Studies, which resulted in numerous publications. Her expertise on treatment courts is frequently sought in presenting at many statewide and national conferences. Dr. Callahan provides training to justice professionals and first responders on trauma-informed practices, including the relationship between the opioid crisis and vicarious trauma. Current research interests include outcomes of specialty courts, the impact of Medicaid expansion on jail recidivism, competence to stand trial, school safety, and vicarious trauma. She first started working at PRA when it was founded in 1988 to 1999, directing the NIMH Insanity Defense Study and receiving an NIMH First Award to evaluate conditional release of persons acquitted by reason of insanity in 4 states. Dr. Callahan has conducted many studies in both the adult and juvenile justice systems, including funding from NIJ, NIMH, OJJDP, and Russell Sage Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. She has numerous publications on topics central to her research and experience. Dr. Callahan is faculty for the National Drug Court Institute, working with them to develop a mental health court training curriculum. She is Professor Emerita from the Sage Colleges, where for 18 years she taught courses in juvenile and criminal defense, mental health, and research methods, and established the MS for forensic mental health program, which is one of the first in the US. So welcome to both of you, and I will let you both begin.
Thank you very much, Erin, for the introduction. I didn't know that you'd go through all of that, but a lot of acronyms in there. So I'm going to switch, hopefully, and share my screen. We were experimenting before. Let's see. Are you able to see that? Okay. Let me go back down. So I was really excited and very appreciative when I was contacted about presenting today to your organization on trauma-informed courts, because it really is a topic of great passion of mine. In talking about the research that's funded, unfortunately to date, there's really not been much of any research that's been funded on trauma-informed courts. I think that's an oversight by all of the various agencies across our borders that fund research. But hopefully, as the topic becomes more of a crucial issue in all of your lives and in everyone else's lives, we'll be able to get some robust funding to look at the importance of trauma-informed courts. So let's jump in, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with trauma, are familiar with the importance of trauma in the work that you do. But I think it's important to set the stage a little bit, to set the context of why now, why in 2021 is trauma really on the lips of so many people across so many different systems. And I think that it's a very timely topic. It's one, though, that certainly existed in decades and decades ago in the courts, but we're now really, we've really reached a time where we're starting to focus more on the importance of trauma and the impact that it has on the people we work with, the people we serve, but also on ourselves, people who work in the criminal justice systems and justice systems across the world. Let's start with the definition, just so we're all kind of centered on this. There are many different definitions that we could use. The one that we use and I use in my work is provided by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration in the United States. It is the federal agency that covers all of the both prevention and treatment and the criminal justice portfolio for the U.S. Health and Human Services Department. So this is SAMHSA's definition of trauma, and it is probably the easiest way to remember it is we refer to it as the 3 E's, and those are highlighted in the slide here, as you can see. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So as you can see, the important part of a bad event becoming a traumatic event is not just that a bad thing happened, because bad things happen to every one of us. Not every day, but certainly over the course of our lifetime. But it's really what happens after the event that turns that into what would be considered a trauma event. And that is really critical. The way that we experience this event when we're in the moment is that we feel in many cases that we're going to come to extreme harm, or someone we care about is going to be harmed, and that it's something that is really overwhelming to our senses. And in many cases,
Callahan,
yes?
I'm just going to quickly interrupt you. We can't see your slides, and I want to make sure we can see those, because the information you're providing is very vital. So if we could just try to, no, if you could just try to share again.
Oh boy. Let me see here. Let's try this again. How's that?
No, we still can't see them.
How about that?
Oh, yep. Perfect. We can see it. Awesome. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. Fortunately, I didn't get very far. I know I was talking quickly, but okay. So, and are you seeing it without the slides on the side?
We're seeing it with the slides on the side, but that's okay. If you. That's
okay. I think I can.
Okay.
Maybe not. I think I'll leave it. Better let sleeping dogs lie, right? So I'm going to leave it the way that it is. So what's important to keep in mind about trauma is that it's not just what happened, but it's the way in which we experience it in the moment and the lasting effects that it has on us in both in the short term and in the long term. And we know that the trauma that is not that it hasn't been identified as trauma and that isn't really isn't treated or dealt with or processed can have lasting effects over the course of someone's lifetime and really affect every part of their being, as described in this definition. So let's talk about why now, why trauma? Why is it something that we're encouraging people who work in the justice system to address? Part of it is the science has really evolved over time. We know that the research that's been done on the adolescent brain shows that we really don't expect people to have a fully developed brain until they're well into their 20s. And we also, consequently, is things that happen to people in their childhood or early adulthood can really have an impact on that brain development. And it can really have an impact on the parts of the brain that require us to deal with our emotions and to deal that fight or flight or freeze response. So it's really important. The science of the brain has really been important in the development of the importance of trauma. And we've also observed people who have worked in the field for a long time have been able to observe the impact of trauma on adults and wondering then, what happened? What happened to this individual that perhaps they don't respond in events that the way that maybe someone typically would. For example, to something that we may experience as really scary and make us want to flee. Someone may, in fact, not see it as a dangerous event. So observing this in your clients and in people who come before you in your courts really has made us ask the question: is what role has trauma had? Perhaps it's not a sort of a therapeutic way to look at trauma, but we also know that trauma costs all of our systems a lot of money. Not dealing with trauma or even providing supports for people with trauma in the justice system is an expensive endeavor. Ignoring it is even more expensive. We know that this trauma, both physical and psychological trauma, has caused a lot of expense in our medical systems, behavioral health, et cetera. So while it might not be the most polite way to think about trauma, it is still an important component to this. And lastly, the political landscape has changed. Across all of our borders, the way in which we have responded to Indigenous people, we're starting to realize was the opposite of a trauma-informed way. And so now we're starting to come to some grips with that and understanding the impact of our actions as governments on people, and also the impact on our soldiers. We know that trauma can rear its head in a delayed response for soldiers once they have left the battlefield. Trauma is, it almost makes it seem dismissive to say that it's really everywhere, that it's very prevalent, because it almost sounds like we're trying to minimize it, but just the opposite. There are many different ways to look at trauma, what would be considered a traumatic event, but just a couple of statistics that exist in Canada. So these are the most recent data that are available. So in 2020, the rate of violent crime across Canada, this may be, you may already know this, but Ontario has the lowest rate of violent crime across Canada. And remember, we're talking about rates. I know you have the largest city, Toronto's the largest city in Canada, and therefore would have the most cases. But in terms of the rate per 100,000 residents, Ontario actually has the lowest violent crime rate. And the northernmost provinces have the highest violent crime rate. But just as an aside, I live in the United States, and nonetheless, your homicide rates are really only 25% of what they are in the United States. So much safer, northern side of the Canadian-US border, but nonetheless, there is still a lot of violent crime across Canada. Another figure that I thought would be worth emphasizing, especially as we start talking about the different ways of looking at trauma, is in 2019 and 2020, there were approximately 9,300 children in foster care just in Ontario. And while the circumstances of the foster care setting may very well be supportive, the fact that children have been removed and placed into foster care indicates that something has happened in their lives, whether it's the death of a parent who's been incarcerated, something else might have happened in the household that required the government to take children from their homes. So even though the foster care environment may be supportive, something happened that required the children to go into foster care. Poverty can also be seen as a type of trauma, in large part because it leads to food insecurity. It leads to compromised health, and it also leads to substandard housing or absence or being threatened of becoming homeless. So 1 in 7 people across Canada live in poverty, and that rate is overrepresented among Indigenous people. And as I said, it affects really all the very basic needs that we have in our existence. Poverty has a negative impact on that. And something else just to keep in mind is that the impact that trauma, perhaps different impact of trauma has and can have on our veterans. And there are about 630,000 veterans across Canada, and about 19% of them are female. So what's in it for you? What is to be gained for you in your profession? And I would also add in just in your personal life for being trauma informed. We know from research that's been done, and especially in settings where people are incarcerated, that being trauma informed, when the staff are trauma informed, it increases public safety. Research out of Rhode Island shows that it reduces the number of incidents, reported incidents, not just inmate on correctional officer, but also among inmates. So being trauma informed changes the environment of the setting. And by exercising universal precautions, that meaning assuming everyone who you come into contact with in the justice system has experienced some form of trauma, can reduce the danger and increase safety for everyone. We know that being trauma informed promotes recovery and public health. By treating trauma and identifying trauma, we can interrupt some of the survival behavior patterns that sometimes are very counterproductive to recovery and to living a full life. We know that it reduces recidivism, acknowledging clients, trauma in not just in your clients, but in your colleagues and yourself as well. And by being trauma informed, reduces the burden on individuals, family, and society overall. Here are some examples of traumatic events, and I think most of us would agree that all of these are traumatic or can be traumatic to many people. There's intentional trauma, there's unintentional trauma, and then other types. That's always the like lumping together a bunch of different types of trauma. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this this last type. I think the first two we understand, we know what that looks like, but the other types of trauma that sometimes we forget about is historical trauma, community trauma, poverty, homelessness, ethnic cleansing, war, and vicarious trauma. So an example of historical trauma that affected the world would be the Holocaust in the 20th century, that millions of people were placed in camps, in prison camps, and many of them were either murdered or died because of the deprivations. That's a type of historical trauma that affects a wide range of people across the world. And each country and each community actually has their own historical traumas that they deal with. In the United States, we're dealing with enslavement, the history of enslavement in the United States. Community trauma would be a type of trauma such as a school shooting, a natural disaster that affected a particular community, like a tornado or a hurricane. I think poverty and homelessness, the others are probably more easily, the examples come to mind. So keep that in mind, that the trauma that your clients and your colleagues and your family members may be experiencing isn't just this intentional trauma, although that's very important, but there's other types of traumas that they either are experiencing or could have experienced over the course of their lifetime. We also know there's a budding area of science called epigenetics. And what that is, what they're finding, what those scientists are finding, is that some of the effects of the historical trauma show up in generations after the generations that actually experienced it firsthand, that it is being transmitted genetically across generations. So it isn't just that something happened in the past, so it has no meaning really or impact on current generations. We're finding that's not the case at all. so I want to back up for just a second. So one of the things I'd really like to stress and is really important is understanding the community that you're working with. Understand the people who come into your court, come into your behavioral health center, come into your law enforcement area, not just to know what happened to them in terms of a particular, if they were the victim of a violent crime, but also what else might be operating in terms of not only the way that of what they've experienced, but also the way in which they might be describing what happened to them. It may be that they don't seem in our sense of emotionally appropriate for what's happened to them, but we don't know what all else has happened to them, to their families, and to their communities to really place any expectation on how someone should respond to something that we all would agree is traumatic. We don't know what happened to them or to their families. So it's really important to get to know the communities that you're working in so that you can start to build a better understanding of the broader types of trauma they've experienced. This is one way of looking at all of that, really as a pyramid. Of course, the base is in fact the base. This is what's happened to both individuals and to families and communities and entire societies. It's that historical trauma piece. And this really is built on, this is generational. This isn't something that just happened to an individual person. And this is therefore going to affect the social conditions that that person lives in, the way that the opportunities that they have, the barriers that they have. This is the more local piece of it. And built into that, then, many of you have probably heard of the adverse childhood experiences. This was originally a checklist of 10 experiences of whether people had these particular events happen over before they were age 18. And we know that, and I'm going to give you just a little peek into the research, we know that those childhood experiences, and we're starting to understand those social conditions and the generational trauma can disrupt neurodevelopment. When children of all ages experience trauma, we know that it can disrupt their neurodevelopment, and that then is going to have an impact on their development. Not just their physical development, but the social, emotional, and cognitive development as well. And subsequently, that can have an impact on not only with their risk-taking behavior, but really their ability to even evaluate something as being risky. So these are all, as I said, these really build this pyramid. If you think about it as building up this base, and we know that people who've experienced trauma, a lot of trauma in particular, die at an earlier age of, and not necessarily of, say, a crime or an accident, but die of disease at an earlier age. So these are the adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs. They can affect a person's physical health, mental health, the risky behavior that they engage in, and also the number of injuries. And as I said, I'll give you a little peek into the research here. These are some studies that have been done to look at people who were participating in the ACEs research. And each one of these health behaviors or outcomes, if you will, are significantly related to the number of adverse experiences that a person had before the age of 18. I think most of us would agree that none of these are healthy. Certainly, we know cigarette smoking is unhealthy. Suicide, obviously, suicide ideation, as well as suicide, attempted suicide or completed suicide. And many of these, if you go through this list and you look at all of these, many of these characteristics, if you will, or outcomes are really strongly associated with people in the justice system. Difficulty controlling anger, having memory impairment, really a lot of physical illness is attached to that early trauma. And the research is cited down here if you'd like to take a look at it more. We also know that there's a strong relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences someone's had and their substance use and their mental health. So again, if you look at these lists of outcomes or behaviors or indicators, many of these are associated with people who are involved in your treatment programs. Many of them come to your attention because of specifically these particular outcomes, such as a person who has witnessed or someone who has experienced trauma in their childhood is more likely to not just witness in a personal violence, but also perpetrating it. So these are many of the behaviors that people will come into contact. Obviously, if someone has a substance use disorder and they are arrested as part of that, they may be showing up in your drug court or one of your other courts. So these are all what I would say in looking across these behaviors and outcomes, if you will. It's important to have them on your radar, because this might not be the reason why someone came into contact with you. It may not be because it may be because they have a substance use disorder, but what you may not see is that relationship with trauma, to their obesity, to some of their sexuality issues, particularly around hypersexuality. These might also be part of their narrative, but not what brought them to your attention. So being aware of all of these different indicators of trauma can really start to lay the groundwork for having a trauma-informed approach. It's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. It's a way of a better understanding of the role that trauma plays in the clients that you work with, the participants in your programs, and in some cases with our coworkers. I'm going to skip over that for now. So there's been an effort at trying to expand the definition of adversity, and I gave you really some suggestion on that with the lower levels of the pyramid that I showed you. So there's been a lot of focus on making sure that we take into account the importance of being poor, so lower socioeconomic status, the impact of peer victimization, all of these that are listed here. Social isolation, which the pandemic has really heightened the social isolation that not just that adults experience, but certainly children as well. And then being exposed to community violence. So people who live in dangerous neighborhoods have higher levels of trauma, even if they were not the direct victim of that violence. There's something called the toxic triad. And what this means is that these three experiences in childhood are very likely to occur together, and they have similar kinds of outcomes. Again, it's important to have on your radar that in homes where there's a lot of domestic violence, where parents or the adult caregivers are combative with one another, both verbally and emotionally and physically. These are also households that have high levels of addiction and high levels of mental illness. Again, taking these together, if you could imagine planning for supervision, planning for treatment, you would want to make sure that you had all of this. It really is as potential focuses for the treatment plan or the supervision plan that you are developing for people in your programs. So I want to turn our attention now to vicarious trauma. This also is getting a lot more attention lately. It's a type of trauma. I'll distinguish it from some other terms that sometimes it's used interchangeably with. It is the same thing as secondary trauma. They really are the same, different words to describe the same thing. Or these are just some examples of ways in which secondary trauma or vicarious trauma have been described. Probably the one that is really sticks out is that cost of caring. That even if you are working in the justice system, which sometimes the primary role of the justice system is not to be a caring system, but instead to be one about accountability. Most people who work in the justice system do still care about the outcome of people. And this is especially true people who work in any kind of diversion program or treatment court. You get to know your clients, you get to know the participants in a way that you don't in just like a one-off docket that you might be also have. And so these are all ways to describe vicarious trauma. Some are very visceral in their description and some more descriptive. So let's talk about what vicarious trauma is not. It's not burnout, okay? And it's not compassion fatigue. Burnout is literally that physical and emotional exhaustion that you get from your work. There's a lot of causes of burnout, but burnout can lead to people quitting because they just can't take it anymore. Too much to do and too little time with too little compensation or respect for what you do. But that's burnout. It's not the same thing as vicarious trauma. And it's also not the same thing as compassion fatigue. This is the cumulative exhaustion or fatigue that you get from being exposed to people who have very rich, very deep traumatic stories that they tell you. And this is very common for people who work in the counseling professions, in the therapeutic professions, but it also is very common for people who work in treatment courts or diversion programs, because you get to know the stories of the people you're working with. Now, what makes vicarious trauma different is that it's this shift in worldview that occurs. Now, remember that with the SAMHSA definition is that it has lasting effects on you. That's the trauma piece. That's when it closes the circle, not just that you're tired, that you've got too much to do, that you just can't really hear another story about another person's very traumatic life, but it's when your worldview shifts and you really start to develop symptoms of trauma as though you experienced them yourself. And this, Charles Figley describes it this way. It's once you've been exposed to trauma, to the scene, the stories, you hear them, you experience them, and you begin to suffer. You begin to suffer the consequences, much as though you had experienced the trauma yourself. That's what the change that takes place. Okay, so it's really important to know it's not the same thing as burnout. Burnout is when you don't have enough resources to do the job. Vicarious trauma is when you start to embody the same symptoms as people who have experienced it firsthand. And some of those symptoms are cognitive, with both compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, but vicarious trauma takes it to that next step. So you have rigid black and white thinking, memory loss, confusion. Think about what I described, the research on the ACEs. Memory loss is a common symptom of trauma. People who are no longer able to recognize cause and effect. People become preoccupied with what they can't control. And dissociation is also a characteristic of vicarious trauma and of primary trauma as well. So some of the emotional symptoms of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue are listed here. You have fear and anxiety, isolation, withdrawal, being overwhelmed even by tasks that didn't used to be overwhelming to you, feeling powerless, being irritable, being angry a lot, having self-doubt about your capabilities, both professionally and personally. And there are also the physical symptoms, as we know from the ACEs studies. And these also can affect people who are experiencing vicarious trauma. So all of what we've learned about primary trauma, whether in your own experiences or courses that you've taken, vicarious trauma, those are risks for people experiencing vicarious trauma as well. So who's at risk in the legal field? The easiest answer is everybody. But think carefully about what people are exposed to in the course of their work. And those are individuals who run the risk of developing vicarious trauma. Okay, they haven't experienced it first, but as Figley has told us, it's the cost of caring because of the work that you do. You hear it over and over and over again. There's been a little bit of research on vicarious trauma among judges, and most of these have been done by judicial organizations in the United States, asking what are the pain points. And for new judges, it's developing that judicial identity, because what happens with that is having to separate yourself from people who were previously your colleagues and perhaps your sounding boards. And so it's really important for judges to have peers who they can share their experiences with. In some communities have special psychologists who will work directly with judges because they understandably have because of their role and the professional isolation, they would not be appropriate for them to share it with just their co-workers. We found that in a survey that was done in 2018 is that a quarter of judges reported that they had missed 10 days or more of work due to stress. Now think about that. That's 2 full work weeks that a quarter of judges admitted that they had missed because of stress. So most judges report that they have experienced and worked toward combating, if you will, secondary trauma. And this isn't just treatment court judges. These are judges who preside over many different kinds of dockets. And one of the surveys that was mentioned on the previous slide is if you look at the cluster of frustrating situations, this is what judges said they have a really hard time with. So it's not just bad things happening, but it's also just the nature of the work can be very frustrating and also complicate or add to the stress that judges experience. There's been a little bit of research on other court professionals. The American Bar Association and the Hazelden Foundation found that attorneys experience high levels of depression, anxiety, and substance use, all of which are symptoms of vicarious trauma. And these are elevated beyond other people who are similar to them in age, race, education level, et cetera. So just attorneys experience very high levels of substance use and alcohol use in particular. Probation officers also report very high levels of trauma and stress related to their work. Interestingly, it's related to longevity in a specific assignment. So working with someone and getting to know them longer by being their probation officer for a longer period of time actually seems to aggravate the vicarious trauma. We know that behavioral health providers, in fact, I think most of you probably are aware that behavioral health started looking at vicarious trauma way before the justice system did. And it really started with people who were counselors to people who'd been the victims of sexual trauma. They started to recognize that some of the same symptoms in people who had experienced sexual trauma that they also recognized in people who had PTSD from other forms of exposure, such as combat trauma. So they started to really move the field, if you will, into looking at not only what their clients had experienced, but what they experienced by working with this population caused some residual trauma in the caregivers themselves. Remember that cost of caring. So these are really to be on the lookout for these symptoms, if you will, is if you're a supervisor, it's really important that you're aware of the symptoms of vicarious trauma and what you should be on the lookout for. Probably what you would most recognize would be change in someone's work product. Unless you have personal conversations with the people you supervise or your coworkers, you probably wouldn't know about difficulties they were having in relationships or that they were feeling burnout, et cetera, or even that health problems that they were having. But you would start to see changes in behavior at work. And those are things, job performance, if you see someone's job performance slipping, people who used to be very attentive to detail, all of a sudden not being, people becoming very cynical, some of your strongest team members, all of a sudden who were always there to have the positive spin on things that happen, taking a more pessimistic view of the future. Those should be clues to you. This should make you concerned and really make sure that you have the supports in place to not only for yourself, but also for the others who work in your program. We know then that that last E of the 3 E's, the event, the experience, and the effect, that these are long-term effects, potentially long-term effects. They really come, if you look inside this Pentagon, we don't see the powerlessness that some of our coworkers or the people we're working with, our clients, have and experience. We probably don't see the anger, the pain, the fear. But what we see instead are what's really on the outside of this, of these 5 points, if you will. We see someone's degraded physical health. We see perhaps their mental health issues, that more depression, more anxiety. Maybe someone is developing obsessive compulsive disorders, et cetera. Behavior problems, especially with the people who come before you in your court. This is what, that's why you know them. Their behaviors have gotten them into trouble. And so they are coming before you or into your program. People with trauma histories often have poor relationships, fractured families, fractured friends, not able to hold a job because of getting into scuffles with coworkers, and of course, substance use. And that's something also which may be why you know someone is because they've come into your program because of their substance use. So we like to think about thinking about the balance, if you will, for trauma, not just for clients and people in your program, but also for our coworkers and ourselves. And there's always ways to build resilience. And there are risk factors that are going to be in place regardless of what we do. The work you do is really hard, and that isn't going to change, but there are ways that we can manage that organizationally and personally to build more resilience. And so this slide just gives some examples. We know that sometimes people are drawn to our work because of their own experiences. So acknowledging that, not just that they may be experiencing vicarious trauma, but may be at risk for developing vicarious trauma because of their own trauma histories, just as an example. So you think about it, fully leafed tree is that resilience that we want to build in people, not just in our clients, but also in ourselves, and also acknowledging what those risk factors are and be able to reduce them to the extent that we can. So I'm going to leave you with one more slide. It's really a way of, it's an African proverb that until the lion has his own storyteller, the tales of the hunt will always favor the hunter. So this can mean a lot of things to us individually, but what I like to think about it is until we talk about trauma, until we acknowledge trauma, not just in ourselves, but in others, and we don't give people a voice to talk about their trauma, we're telling their story, and they should be telling the story themselves. So I will end with that. And here's my contact information. I welcome you to contact me if you have questions. And now I will turn it over to Robin.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And it seems like I'm having the same issue of, here we go, of showing the slides. Here we go. Thank you. So thank you, Lisa, for all of that information. Certainly those of us who are very much passionate about this work never feel like there's enough time to talk about it, and likely feel that rushing through it is kind of anti-trauma informed. I'm going to try to focus on some of the most pertinent issues as I do my section. I do tend to use I'm sorry, there are things in my screen. I do tend to use the iceberg when I talk about trauma. And that is partly because I'm from Newfoundland, and partly because I think it is very appropriate to know that what we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, and there is so much underneath. So if we are going to work with trauma-informed principles, then we are also learning to embrace complexity. And sometimes complexity causes us to look the other way or say things like that client is inappropriate for our program, rather than reversing it and saying our program is inappropriate for the client. So this is all about embracing complexity. A trauma-informed approach, and this is from SAMHSA, to services or intervention acknowledges the prevalence and impact of trauma, attempts to create a sense of safety for all participants, whether or not they have a trauma diagnosis. Becoming trauma-informed requires re-examining policies and procedures that may result in participants feeling loss of control in specific situations, training staff to be welcoming and non-judgmental, and modifying physical environments. The goal is to fully engage participants by minimizing perceived threats, avoiding re-traumatization, and supporting recovery. There is often little or no cost involved in implementing trauma-informed principles, policies, and practices. There's a lot in that statement, so I'm going to try to break it down for you. We can provide trauma-informed care. Today, I'm going to focus on courts and court systems and the court and treatment partnerships, universal precautions, and use of language. So the courts and treatment partnerships. So the court system or the justice system is where trauma and justice collide. The prevalence of trauma among those incarcerated is staggering. The system is design is inherently wrought with non-trauma informed components. In our courts, we have physical environments and court processes that are meant to demonstrate power over the people who come into our courts. I'm going to talk a little bit about danger zones for the partnership between justice and treatment and solutions. So I talked about the prevalence. If you look at these statistics, you'll see things like people in jails, 91% of women, 80% of men, 86% of men have experienced lifetime physical violence. There's the PTSD statistics. All of this to say, I mean, 2/3 of women and men in substance abuse treatment report childhood physical or sexual abuse. All of this is to say, if you work in this field, you work with people who have experienced and are experiencing trauma. So why are prisons and jails particularly triggering environments? Because they're designed with the criminal's perpetrator mindset. I will tell you that I have never met someone in, for instance, our drug treatment court who was not a victim first, but the system thinks of them as a perpetrator and not a victim. There's confinement and overcrowding and lack of privacy in jails. There's lack of control and choice and restricted movement, and there are searches. Things are often similar to the abuse environments that they have experienced. So everything about jails just compound that sense of trauma and those trauma triggers. It is harder in jail to get primary coping mechanisms. It's not impossible, but it is harder. And most of the clients we come in contact with, for now, drugs are their primary coping mechanisms. I think sometimes we have this black and white, drugs are bad and abstinence is good, but we cannot underestimate that until other mechanisms are developed, drugs are what people use to self-medicate and deal with their trauma. And you also have high worker stress in prisons and jails. Why are courtrooms and court proceedings particularly triggering environments? Well, they are meant to accentuate power and control. So they are wrought with this othering people. So there are the good people who get to sit up the front, and there are the bad people who get to sit behind the barriers. There are all sorts of symbols of power, from the dais that the judge sits on with the physical setup, the barriers, the police presence, there's weapons and handcuffs. There are reactions if people make a misstep. There is the situation where someone else speaks for you and you're almost in a situation of needing to be seen and not heard. You have people talking about you and not including you. I remember when I worked with young parents and they would go to court because their children were being taken away from them and being put in the system. And they would have the prosecutor and their workers sitting up at the front before court started, laughing and joking with each other because they were friends. Well, all the client wanted to do was just run, thinking that they had no power whatsoever. And there is some assumption made that you are dangerous. People are silenced, and one of my favorites is this. And I will tell you that in the Toronto Drug Treatment Court, there's going to be a new courthouse in Toronto, and we have been able to get a purpose-built courtroom, because one of the things I say, especially to new students who are coming into drug treatment court, is when you are sitting in the body of the court and you have the Crown and the defense and all of the people up in front of you, you have the judge on a dais looking down at you, and then all of the other people have their backs to you. And I call that the wall of backs, or the wall of power. So let's talk about the danger zones. The danger zones of partnerships with the court. So I was talking to my team recently and I said, the whole existence of a drug treatment court is an ethical dilemma. And normally we would not partner with and give information to people in the court, especially crowns or judges. But there's a danger in partnering, and we have to be cognizant of these dangers. For instance, there is the danger of the treatment team relying on the power of the court rather than relying on their clinical skills. This is hard work. And when you're in a relationship with a court team, often we can get to that point where, oh, the court has power, so let's use the court to make this job a little easier for us. There's role blurring sometimes, in fact, often. And I think that one of the things that we have to be careful of in such a partnership is to not blur the roles too much, but also not to be too rigid with the roles. Everybody has their unique partnership, and I think of it as a Venn diagram. We're not all completely separate when we come together like this. In the center is the client, and there's a lot of flexibility by all of the partners in such a partnership. We need to keep strong boundaries, but we need to reconsider what boundaries are. When Lisa was talking about vicarious trauma, certainly one of the things that we have to remember, and which can put us more in danger of this vicarious trauma, is that we can't really help people unless we come up close to that boundary line. And one of the ways I envision it is, if we are too far away from that boundary line, that means knowing the client and knowing who they are and caring about them, then we are of no use. If we go over the boundary line, then we are no use either. We actually tend to cause harm. And not valuing or understanding therapeutic rapport is also one of the danger zones. When we come together in a partnership such as drug treatment court, this is not business as usual. The therapeutic nature of the courts and dealing with the clients is important. And the therapeutic nature is reflective of, in another way to say, trauma-informed care. So what do? We talk about universal precautions. Whether it is obvious or not that someone has been impacted by trauma, the best way to approach everyone is as if they have trauma. We will harm people who are impacted by trauma if we don't do this, but we will not harm people who aren't impacted by trauma if we do treat them in a trauma-informed way. So trauma knowledge is one of the ways that we apply universal precautions. So trauma responses are often misunderstood and misinterpreted. It makes our work ineffective or less effective, and sometimes even re-traumatizing. So we need to know what trauma is. We need to know what we're seeing. I often say that if the responses that a client is giving don't make sense, then please assume trauma. Step back and assume it. And when we don't understand trauma, this can cause a reaction from us of restricting service, of increasing dropouts or discharges. Trauma-informed care means that we look for ways to not discharge people for proving by their behaviors that they need us. Lisa talked about some of the root causes of trauma. Here are some of those repeated: the physical abuse, incarceration itself, grief and loss, delayed grief, witness to violence and death, all of the childhood, adverse childhood effects. And I've listed them there. But what is really important is that it is not how we rate these events. It is how the person experiences it. One of the things that is important in our thought process is not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you when we are dealing with different behaviors that are reflective of a trauma approach. What are some of the trauma triggers? Well, sounds, odors, touch, familiar situations, voice, tone, confinement. It really depends on the person and their experience, and we cannot always anticipate it, which is another reason why we apply universal precautions. Some of the symptoms: panic, fear, fight, freeze or flight, anger, defensiveness, agitation, avoidance, detachment, self-harm. Hypervigilance is huge. Sleeplessness, startle reflexes, intrusive experience. Substance use and mental illness are symptoms of trauma. And when emotions don't match the situation, when in doubt, assume trauma. There are some key principles to help us frame our actions and thoughts and interactions, like acknowledgement in everything we say or do, even the materials that we provide, creating safety plans, making sure our physical environments are safe, trustworthiness, giving people choice and control, relational and collaborative approaches, and a strengths-based and empowerment model. We could spend a day talking about all of those things, but I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to continue on. There are some bigger picture strategies, like doing a self-assessment, developing a decision-making framework, ensuring that we have a trauma-informed lens, engaging in cultural humility and paying attention to treatment evidence, remembering why we exist. So a drug treatment court exists because punishment has not worked. So thinking that punishment is going to change people who have been in and out of jail for most of their lives is just putting them back in the same situation that they came to us under. Meeting, discussing, and processing, keep talking to each other. And a framework or a mindset that I call deposits versus withdrawals. Every time we approach somebody with a trauma-informed approach, with therapeutic rapport, we are making a deposit. Every time we ask them to do something, whether it's requirements of the court or treatment, we are taking a withdrawal. When people are resisting, it often means that we need to deposit more. And there's no formula for this. This is about the person, not about us, not about how much time or how much effort. It's individual. And people with extreme trauma need a lot of deposits in order to feel that trust and to feel that safety. And then there's language and attitude and values. How we view the client and this work matters. We all have assumptions and biases and values, and there are common practices within this work that are really outdated. What we say matters: labels and expectations and substance use terminology. All of those things play into stigmatizing and re-traumatizing. So, for instance, we often develop remedies based on how we view or value the individual. And so when treatment and courts combine, the court system traditionally thinks of people as offenders. And if you break down that word, then we think of people as being offensive. In treatment, we use client or participant, and we don't label them as an offender. Court systems talk about fact and evidence, And in the treatment world, we talk about process and context and defining success. Before I go to the next step, I do want to make it clear that I am not saying that court systems are not trauma-informed and treatment systems are. But I think that when we're talking about a partnership between court and treatment, looking at the treatment evidence about how we treat people with trauma really matters. And I think our systems do look at people differently. The court system, especially Crowns, have to think about safety for public, and treatment thinks about safety for the client, for instance, trauma and harm reduction. And the court system often thinks about consistency and fairness. So they think about equal, and we often think about individualizing and making things equitable. As soon as we make things the same for everyone, we are actually making them unequitable for a number of people. The court system is about external motivation, and we want to move in a trauma-informed way to internal motivation. The authority and power that I've talked about versus therapeutic rapport and relationship building. I think most people would know that one of the top indicators of a client's success is the relationship they have with the judge. And the court system thinks about judging behaviors, and a trauma-informed approach is accepting behaviors as the person's best attempt in the moment and something they can improve over time. We often talk about offenders deserving limited opportunities or deserving jail as opposed to deserving opportunities. So, are we trauma-informed or are we not trauma-informed? I did talk about doing a self-assessment, and these are some of the things that can help us do that self-assessment. I'm going to just focus on the not trauma-informed. So a lack of education about trauma and impacts, and you can see the other part of the slide. Misdiagnosis of trauma responses, so judging people on their responses without thinking about what might be behind it. The tradition of toughness and reliance on heavy-handed and confrontational approaches. This is how treatment systems used to be, and this is certainly how many court systems still are. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for most people. Some of you will say, well, I know somebody who really wanted that tough approach. So yeah, it does work for some people, but typically that tradition of toughness does not work. Safety cultures work. A closed system, advocacy is discouraged. We are the experts, as opposed to collaborating and realizing that the client is an expert in their own life and also an expert in substance use. Lack of understanding leads to client blaming and misinterpretation, focusing on external control and motivation, and authority, rules, and consequences are all drawbacks of a non-trauma-informed system. Labeling language such as manipulative, needy, provocative, non-compliant. Yes, this is one of my pet peeves. I'll use one example. We are all manipulative. If I am smiling doing this presentation, I am trying to elicit a response from you. If I am yelling and being forceful during this presentation, I am trying to elicit a response from you. Our clients are doing the best they can to get their needs met, and we often label that as being manipulative. Lack of respect and routine actions like yelling and issuing orders and tough talk and not providing privacy is not trauma-informed. Imposing automatic and inflexible consequences for rule violations. That going back to punishing people when they prove they need our services. Power and control residing exclusively with staff, and rules and demands for compliance. If we don't give over some power and control to clients, then we will not be successful. Trauma is at its core a a situation in which people do not have power. They have lost their power and control, and that is what causes the trauma. And adaptive behaviors, so substance use, mental health issues, some of the anger issues, some of the other things that our clients display are actually adaptive behaviors. And if we see them as intentional or self-destructive or confrontational or uncooperative or manipulative or provocative, then that is not trauma-informed. Seeing them as a function of adaptive behaviors and understood as survival strategies and resilience and quest for safety is more trauma-informed. If you want to see something about trauma-informed courts and judges, this is a great resource that's online. I will mention this. This is something that I talk about often about language. You know, we use languages and labels a lot, and people say, well, they're just short forms, or I don't mean it. And I think that you can start at any part of this chart and keep cycling through. As we talk about our clients, we start valuing them that way. As we value them, we start treating them that way. As we treat them, they believe that they are that person. And as they believe, they act. What do our actions and practices and rules say about our values? Do we value trauma-informed care? And as Lisa has talked about with vicarious trauma, how do we stay grounded? I firmly believe that meeting in teams, and in our treatment teams, we get clinical supervision. I think that court teams actually need an equivalent. I've started processing deaths, not just with our treatment team, but also with our court team. I think those things are really important. We need to stay grounded in order to provide effective trauma-informed care. This is a quote which I will end with. The most significant predictor of treatment success is an empathic, hopeful, continuous treatment relationship in which integrated treatment and coordination of care can take place through multiple treatment episodes. That's Dr. Ken Minkoff. And it's important, it's multiple. One size does not fit all. One episode of treatment does not usually fix or cure someone. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. I recognize the time. So I'm going to truncate my my remarks to 3 minutes. And if at any time anyone is to send in a question, I'll interrupt my comments and go to the question. So the Q&A is there. A number of years ago, a group of us went across the country to try and collect stories from people with lived experience. We collected about 52 stories from people with lived experience, and we published it in a book called People, Places, and Things. And you remember, I also, this morning, for those of you who were here, I read out a story from that particular book. And there is something about those stories that illustrate trauma in what the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has described as the 3 E's, right? They all always show an event, something happens, the person that it happens to experiences something, and has an effect. So for example, you saw SF, the therapist who I talked about yesterday, today, this morning, who, as a result of having to cut down a woman, a girl who had committed suicide, suffered some vicarious trauma and the impact that had on him. And it demonstrated how a trauma-informed strategy helped them. So SAMHSA talks about 6 principles which I try to apply in my courtroom environment, trying to create safety for people who come in, because we understand that people we see have experienced trauma. We experience trauma ourselves, trying to create trustworthiness and transparency, ensuring that there's peer support. TF shows the fact that we need to support each other. I'm sure in your teams, you've seen people who've had a rough day because of the things that we experienced and the need for support, the need for collaboration and mutuality, then the need to ensure empowerment and in terms of voice and choice for the people who appear before us, and the need to address cultural, historical, and gender issues. And Terence Walton will address that when he speaks on Thursday. Now, I'm just going to end with the 3 R's because we have run out of time. The 4 R's. When people are appearing before us, it's important for us to realize that prevalence of trauma, we've heard that, recognize how trauma affects individuals, and respond to it effectively and with compassion, and try to resist re-traumatization. I will commend 2 sources of material to anybody who is interested. If you want to understand trauma, the SAMHSA guide SAMHSA has excellent material on trauma. But there is a document that has been prepared by the National Judicial Institute that doesn't say a single word about trauma, but talks about how judges and people in the justice system could treat people fairly. That guide, called Problem Solving in Canada's Courtrooms, is an excellent guide in terms of trying to adopt a trauma-informed approach when people appear in the courtroom, whether they are in whether it's in a treatment court or in a not treatment court. And with that, I think I have to end. Erin, over to you.
Huge thank you to both Robin and Dr. Callahan. We appreciate the very insightful presentations, and we appreciate your time here today as well. So thank you very much.